So the 4 stages, phase 1 and phase 2, ownership remains individual, where people joining the co-ops continue to have their own land. So private ownership remains a thing. People that own more land get more profits. People that own less land get fewer profits. But across phase 1 and phase 2, the benefits of owning land is going to gradually decrease as more of the profits go to the people that work it rather than pure ownership. Phase 3 is when it really changes as land ownership is restructured and kind of like what it means to own land is restructured. Sarkar says that land is redistributed according to 2 factors, which is the minimum land necessary to maintain a family and the farmer's capacity to utilize land. So because it sounds like portions are going to people, that kind of sounds like ownership is still a thing. However, throughout these phases, because the benefits of owning land are decreasing, it seems more like there's going to be some sort of restructuring of what ownership means. So people are not, if you have a lot of land, but you cannot farm it yourself, you will not get any money. You will not get any profits or dividends from just owning it. Therefore, there is no benefit to own more than what you can actually work. So the redistribution that happens is most likely going to be use rights that is going to be redistributed. So just as a matter of convenience, people might still own 10 acres rather than 1 acre or whatever, but it might just be more beneficial for it to kind of like collectively be owned, or like ownership and management is just kind of go into the same pot, just so that since the cooperative will most likely be the one that will be helping redistribute kind of like land use. So people that have a lot of land but can't work it will just give their portions away for use so that more people can evenly distribute who's working the land. And then by phase 4, you have no conflict over land ownership because it doesn't really benefit you to own more land than you can actually work. Ownership is going to be like the actual ownership will be more like just collective management. And individual ownership is going to have more of a sense of land relationship rather than ownership. So it's not about getting profits or controlling the land. It's more about like people will have their plots, or people will have certain areas that they work, and people will be able to kind of develop more relationship with their land through usufructuary rights. So you will have use rights rather than ownership. So that's going to be by decreasing the benefits of ownership, you will transform the way that ownership is thought of and how it's valued. Like everyone else brought up, it's very different in America than in what Sarkar is laying out. So some differences are phase 1, he talks a lot about uneconomic plots of land. There are people that have these, I guess, but most of the land in America is the giant monocrop fields that are owned by corporations. So most of the productive land is held by very few corporations. So there might not be that much of a need for phase 1 and more of a need for phase 2. And then the question of who would want to restructure their land when there's, all they're going to be doing is losing profits by giving up their land. So in the US, the phased approach might look different in that maybe phase 1 is shorter or doesn't really exist in the way that Sarkar imagines. Phase 2 might be longer or have more stages to it. And because the people with the most land are the big powerful corporations, it might be that the incentives need to be stronger. There's not going to be as many natural kind of incentives for people to choose to join cooperatives on a small level. If you're going to be turning larger plots of land into a cooperative, the incentives might need to be forceful, and we might need to rely more on policy and mandates to restructure mega farms. So the motivations for moving from each stage, Sarkar talks about the difference between an internal urge and external pressure. He also talks about that cooperatives need to evolve out of collective labor and community, so it has to grow organically. We cannot just have a ruling and suddenly hand over land to cooperative management. So that's going to make it tricky, because in America, we're going to need to kind of push change over from land into cooperative management, but it also has to grow in an organic way so that people build the wisdom and knowledge for how to work in cooperatives without just like mandating that it happen without people having the skills. So internal urges might be things as far as people like to see the need for economic transition. They have to be invested in changing it for themselves and their communities. External pressures would be things like government mandates, economic incentives, peer pressure from consumers, and hopefully providing pressure but not force until people are ready. So we talked about the phase 0 that's kind of implied in these 4 phases. Before this transition can even happen, there has to be some prerequisites that happen that are existing in the culture. So there has to be a culture of integrated economic environment, there have to be common economic needs and a ready market for cooperatively produced goods. So we have to live in a society that's kind of ready for this shift to take place before it can start. In phase 1, there are some incentives for like smaller plots of land to join cooperatives. One is going to be expanded education around cooperative economies and management, which will increase interest and knowledge. People will be more aware of it and have more training and knowledge about it. 2, landowners with small plots of land can benefit by pooling resources while maintaining individual ownership. You don't lose your ownership, you can just benefit by cooperating with others. So this is more applicable to places like India, where there are landowners that meet this criteria, but landowners with large productive farms, like in America, will have little motivation to change at this stage. The government is also going to provide assistance to agricultural cooperatives, and I think a big one is the sale of agricultural land is going to be prohibited. This is the first step to de-incentivizing the ownership of agricultural land, because if agricultural land specifically can't be bought and sold, that's going to be a blow to kind of like what you can do through ownership. In phase 2, Sarkar just says encourage economic land holdings to join cooperatives, but he doesn't really explain what that means. So some possibilities could include things like tax increases for agricultural land holdings that are not part of a cooperative, or tax breaks for those that join. Landowners that join a cooperative during this stage will receive dividends. If they join later, they will not. So if people know that this shift is coming, there is an incentive to join earlier rather than later. Because you'll at least receive dividends for a while. In places where mega farms must be broken up, it might be important to implement the 3-tiered economy mandate for agricultural industry, if not the entire economy, but at least for agriculture. So any agricultural business employing more than like 10 to 20 people must be restructured as a cooperative. That would be a way to force the restructuring of really big farms. In phase 3, landowners are going to be prohibited from employing individual laborers, landless laborers, or sharecroppers for the cultivation of land. This was brought up earlier, but that just means that like if you cannot employ anyone to work your land, and it has to be all you really have no ability to make use of that land if it's more than you need. At this point, 100% of the profits are going to be going to laborers, which means that, again, there's no incentive for you to own more than you need because you don't get profits just by owning it. At this point, either all agricultural land should be cooperatively managed, or the rule should apply to both private enterprises and cooperatives. If there are still agricultural private ownership at this point, if not everything is cooperative, it should apply across the board. So it's not just about cooperatives making this change. Everyone should be like, you do not get profits from owning land. People are not going to be forced to give up their land. They simply no longer receive a benefit from owning it. It's not a matter of mandating, like, you have to give away your land now. You can keep it if you want, but you're not going to get money for it. And then some other possibilities, you could provide an option for cooperatives to buy out member shares. So maybe the government could help with kind of funding this, but you might give your land to a cooperative, but you might have an agreement where you will receive dividends for a set amount of time as kind of like selling your land to the community. So if you have worked really hard and spent all your life savings building this farm that you have that you're really proud of, you're not going to be happy about all these policies coming through, basically saying, give away your stuff. And decreasing your ability to gain profit from it. But if there's an option in place being like, I'm going to enter into an agreement where it's kind of like a gradual buyout over several years, you will get some money back from what you've invested. So if you own land and you take pride in it, and it's a kind of a very important economic piece for you, you can get some benefit while still transitioning to this cooperative model. And if you want to see it in a Gantt chart, here's a Gantt chart. This is just all the incentives that Sarkar lays out, along with some ones in blue that are potential ones that we came up with. And this is just when they would be implemented. So you'd have some phase 1 incentives, phase 2 incentive, and phase 3 incentives, and things like prohibiting the agricultural sale of land, mandating that all the profits go to laborers, and prohibiting landowners from employing laborers. These kind of like gradually chip away at what ownership means and how it would be structured, so that by the time you get to phase 3 and 4, land ownership for agricultural land has been transformed.